Hi everyone, welcome to our presentation of submission 0118 for Data for Policy 2022. We'll be speaking about data stewardship towards responsible sharing of public data, and we'll be doing this through an analysis of stewardship models that have been used or are currently being deployed towards better urban governance. My name is Amrita Nanda, and my colleague Vinay and I will be presenting this on behalf of Aapti Institute based in Bangalore, India. We're extremely grateful for the opportunity to present at Data for Policy this year. Essentially, what we'll be talking everyone through during this presentation is the abstract for a work in progress paper. We'll be discussing a little bit of the case studies that we've already been looking at, as well as sharing some early hypotheses that, of course, will evolve as this research continues to unfold. For a little bit of context, my work at Aapti Institute centers primarily around data stewardship or other modes of human-centered data governance. We look at human-centric data governance through the lens of policy, through infrastructural measures, and particularly look towards models that help equalize the power dynamic in the existing data economy towards communities and users. So I'll hand over to Vinay for an introduction as well now.
Thanks, Amrita. Hi, everyone. I'm Vinay Narayan. I'm a senior research associate at Aapti Institute. Much like Amrita in my time at Aapti, I have also been looking at models of data stewardship, and I will go into more detail on what we mean by stewardship in the course of our presentation. While my focus has been on models of stewardship across various sectors, I have focused specifically on the environment and sustainability space, looking at stewards within agriculture. Our work has included speaking to stewards from different contexts across the world, and this has helped us distill principles of what we believe are core tenets of responsible data stewardship, and we seek to draw from these in our paper as well. Moving on to the meat of the paper in itself, we aren't strangers to the harmful use of data by private sector entities. However, what we thought is important to highlight is the fact that this misuse of data by private sector entities occurs not only in the scenario of data held by the entity themselves, but cuts across various modalities of access to data. We identified three main modalities of access to data, which are data that's privately held or proprietary data, data that's available for purchase or transfer from other intermediaries or third parties, and finally, open data or data that's available publicly. In each of these cases, we have seen instances of enormous misuse of data. And while our paper speaks about multiple cases, we thought it prudent to highlight two in each of these instances. In the first one, and this is something that, again, we're not really strangers to, but given that it happens in many, many instances, but the ones that we sought to highlight here were first data that's collected and held by Uber and how they use this data to train their algorithms at the cost of the welfare of their workers or their driver partners. We all know that Uber collects an enormous amount of data from its drivers, and it's been shown across various jurisdictions in multiple ways that this data is then used to tailor its algorithms to increase Uber's bottom line. Our work in India specifically has also involved speaking to a number of drivers who work on the Uber platform and speaking to them as well as trade unions and a number of other policy researchers. We have understood how this works in many different ways. To begin with, for example, back when a lot of the incentives were tied to the number of rides that a driver might complete in a week, let's say, we observed that, or rather the experience of drivers was that in many cases, as they got closer to accomplishing their targets, they would be allocated fewer and fewer rides, making it a lot more difficult for them to meet these targets. The fact that Uber collects this enormous amount of data and has significant control over their workers has also been recognized in courts in many jurisdictions, including the UK, the Netherlands, as well as California, where more and more courts are now slowly recognizing that Uber exercises effective control over the workers to effectively act as an employer, making them an employee, entitling them to the benefits that a typical employee would. But this is just a sign of just how much this data is collected and how it's used in a problematic way against the workers. The second example is the use of customer data collected by Amazon and how they use this to differentiate or use a model of variable pricing to encourage people to buy certain products at certain particular given times. By analyzing the vast trove of data that they collect from customers using either their app or on the website itself, Amazon is able to develop trends of who is looking to buy what sort of product at what time based on the demographic of that person as well, and can then adjust the pricing of products um, to either sell more or encourage people to buy them. In the second modality of data access is data that's available for purchase or transfer from another intermediary. The prime use case that we do really want to highlight here is the high profile case where grinder data was purchased through brokers and was used to reveal the sexual orientation of a Catholic priest. This took place in the US, where a third party who runs an online newsletter was able to purchase data from the app Grinder, and this data was purchased through brokers. Now, even though this data was anonymized, um, the people who purchased the data were able to identify this individual in person and were able to reveal extremely personal details about this person as well, in what turned out to be a very, very serious violation of privacy. The other use case is something that I'm sure a lot of us are very, very familiar with. This is the Cambridge Analytica data scandal. Now, while this data was technically not purchased by Cambridge Analytica, but obtained through the use of an app that shared Facebook data of users, it is data that's nonetheless coming from a third party. And we all know how this data was used to manipulate voter behavior in what turned out to be a serious threat to democracy. The last modality is open data, and even with this, we see a lot of harmful practices by the private sector. The first use case that we would want to highlight is that of genetic sequence data that's available openly. The Convention on Biodiversity requires that genetic sequencing data be made available openly. However, it also places certain conditions on access and benefit sharing of data and information that come within the convention. Regeneron is an American pharmaceutical company that was able to access genetic information from Guinea, which technically would belong to the Guinean government. And they were able to develop a vaccine for the Ebola virus using this. On the back of this, they received funding upwards of $400 million to create or make this vaccine available. But the problem was that there was no adequate benefit sharing done towards Guinea or towards the area from which they acquired this genetic sequencing information. And then it would only rely on Regeneron making these vaccines available at a very affordable rate to African governments to actually provide the Ebola vaccine in Africa, which we're not sure has happened. The last thing that we want to highlight is predictive policing algorithms, which are trained on public criminal records. These are AI algorithms which are trained on the basis of historical publicly available criminal records, but as has been seen across various jurisdictions in the US, they tend to perpetuate the existing biases within these criminal records, and as a result, people of color are profiled more and are at a higher risk of being predicted to have committed a crime. So these have resulted in a number of risks, and we have bucketed them in four large sections: intrusion or a violation of privacy, manipulation of user behavior, discrimination against communities, and private gains at the cost of a wider social benefit. In terms of macro level learnings, we notice that there is a distinct lack of trust in the use of data by private entities. We notice that these predatory practices exist regardless of the existence of data regulations, which isn't to say that regulations are completely useless. They have their value, but goes to prove the point that they are inadequate to prevent the harms. And this is a result of how quickly the technology develops and the lack of capacity in policymakers to understand the way that the technology works. So what's clear, however, is that we can't allow for data to be locked up, as there is an enormous potential for social good and better policies. We propose that data stewardship can be a possible solution for this. To begin with, who are stewards? So we see stewards as trusted independent intermediaries that often lie between users, fiduciaries, and data requesters. In this regard, a steward is envisioned as a body that acts in the interest of the data subjects and works to negotiate and protect their rights over data and enable greater agency and transparency for those whose data is being shared. The role of a steward is not just in rights preserve, but also in generating value. And so they also allow for this data to be shared for public good purposes. We see stewards playing a variety of roles, which are also listed on the side of this slide, and are some of what I've already spoken about. Um, but we are already seeing a number of examples of stewards or steward-like initiatives in many sectors, as both Amrita and I mentioned earlier on in the presentation. Here, we're highlighting a few examples which we see as being very relevant to urban governance. These case studies span different models and different modes of data collection and deal with both private and public data. The first that we'd like to talk about is that of Decode. Decode is a project that was piloted in Amsterdam and Barcelona and provided tools that put individuals in control of whether they kept their personal information private or shared it for public good. This was a landmark project in that it resulted in a very successful proof of concept of how individuals can be empowered through technology to share data that can then be used by innovators and startups to design solutions for the community. And so there was a realization of public value whilst preserving individual rights and interests. The second case study is that of Posmo. Posmo is a cooperative based in Switzerland who have their own app, and users of the app logs mobility data, and users are typically cooperative members. And this data is then used by Posmo to engage with local governments to design better urban policy. In our last conversation with them, they mentioned that they are working with the government of Zurich to help better design urban infrastructure for Zurich. And the cooperative nature of this model means that there is collective ownership and even a big say in who the data is shared with and for what purposes. The third use case is that of Healthy Street Scorecard. This is slightly different in that it is not a stewardship initiative as such. It is a steward-like initiative. And what they do is combine crowdsourced data as well as public data to create a scorecard for each of London's boroughs, with the aim of improving air quality, road safety, boosting active lifestyle, and reducing carbon emissions. This data is derived from private sources, including community-generated maps, as well as public sources such as data that's been released by Transport for London. All of this is done with the aim of improving urban governance within the boroughs of London. Finally, is the University of Washington's Transportation Data Collaborative. This is a collaborative that's governed by the University of Washington, which manages, distributes, and secures data shared by mobility providers. The stakeholders involved are considered as members or project partners who share roles and responsibilities based on a framework of trust. As the steward, University of Washington is able to incentivize these players to share data by creating a digital layer that prevents data from being accessed by competitors, and so accounts for a lot of competition concerns that typically pop up. Finally, the collaborative management structure comprises an oversight committee, which is chaired by key stakeholders from across the city of Seattle who are involved in providing consultation, direction, and project oversight. There are, of course, immense learnings from all of these case studies, which trickle down into the principles that we have identified. And with that, I will hand it back to Amrita.
Thanks, Vinay, for outlining a lot of the case studies that we've seen. I'll speak a little bit now about what our paper actually aims to do. We have three sort of primary research objectives that we've set out with. As Vinay already described, we find that data stewardship as a model holds incredible potential for the responsible sharing and usage of data. So, one of our earliest goals will be to highlight case studies of successful instances in which the private sector use of public sector data has in some way contributed to wider societal good. This will also entail a definition of what public value can look like in the context of data sharing. Next, we'll identify the modes of public sector data usage and how they can be how these modes can be deployed to generate greater public trust and benefit. This also includes finding modalities with which to inspire greater trust between the public and private sector to ensure greater accountability for the private sector and greater visibility towards communities and the public sector more broadly. Lastly, and this is the sort of primary hypothesis or goal of this paper, is to distill the necessary pillars that can enable stewardship initiatives to develop, to grow, and to sort of thrive in an ecosystem that supports them. One of uh, One of our many key learnings throughout the case studies we've looked at so far has been that often in the absence of a wider ecosystem, and this includes policy measures, infrastructural measures, and the involvement and trust between other stakeholders. In the absence of such an ecosystem, a lot of stewardship initiatives, despite having great potential or being very promising, fail to sustain or be able to scale in the way that we'd like to see for better urban governance, for example. So the sectors that we're looking at, sustainability becomes a really key factor. The enablers that we'll be concluding this work with will be geared towards greater trust, a wider ecosystem, and most importantly, the sustainability of such initiatives. In terms of how our analysis is going to look, we have sort of three layers that correspond to the three goals of this paper. Um, as Vinay already described, there's been great potential and proven harms of use of data by the private sector. A lot of this can be mitigated by the accountability layers that stewardship allows these models to instill. And at the same time, there's enormous potential for data to be used for public good, particularly in the context of urban governance. So given that data stewardship is a pathway for this, we'll be using these case studies to expand the scope of existing research and to see how public sector data can be made available for private use and how private sector data can be made available for public use. Finally, we'll be using this analysis to narrow down on the principles that are required to enable greater data stewardship and to make sure that it is sustainable. So to conclude, I'll talk a little bit about what our early hypotheses are. These will evolve as our research grows, as well as our case studies expand. Some of the principles that we believe will be necessary to encourage the growth and development of data stewardship initiatives include layers of accountability, both towards stakeholders with and without data access. So this includes accountability towards communities, towards end users, and towards the public sector more broadly. This needs to be codified in either through policy mechanisms or through policies adopted by stewards themselves. And this is where we think that data stewards or an intermediary can play an extremely helpful role is in creating this accountability and increase leverage or sort of negotiating capacity for communities as a representative that is rooted within communities. The second principle that we see as an early but very important pillar is access and purpose limitations for data usage and for data sharing, as well as for any data generation that takes part during these initiatives. We believe that data stewardship can allow these limitations to be embedded or to be codified, and can also allow communities to have a significant say in what these purpose limitations are, as well as in a case by case manner. For example, in the one member, one vote model that a lot of data cooperatives are able to adopt. These are just some of the solutions that we think data stewardship can offer. And we believe that most of the principles that create accountable, responsible data sharing are those that are embodied in in models of data stewardship that we've seen. In our research over the past few years, not limited to case studies that we've already discussed, we've also found that different sectors and different data types call for completely different models of data stewardship. So we believe that um, a structure this flexible can be deployed in a diverse manner across jurisdictions and across different legislatory landscapes to sort of create the best fit for the various data uses. So with that, we'll conclude our presentation for now. Thank you for viewing. We will add that our eventual recommendations will include a more nuanced version of our early hypotheses and principles. A portion of this will also be featured in the actual conference itself, for which a large number of our team will be attending as well. So we look forward to digging into these questions a little more and seeing what comes up in terms of the essential pillars for data stewardship towards public good.